Hey everybody, I'm Dan from Bishop Fox. Let's get going into today's presentation. This is getting the most out of your penetration tests. So let me start by introducing myself. I'm Dan here at Bishop Fox. I'm a Bishop Fox old schooler at this point, I suppose. I've been here for like 12 years, like 15 years in the industry in general. These days, I'm working on our AI-based penetration testing service. But before that, I was a longtime pen tester here at Bishop Fox. I've had engagements for just about everything under the sun, from application penetration testing and web apps to mobile applications, cryptographic protocols, critical infrastructure, you name it. So after all this experience in doing penetration testing, naturally we have opinions on the best way to run a pen test. This is obviously a major investment for you as a company to into the future of the security of your products or services. And so we really want to have you get the most out of the value of the time for those services. So the way this is going to work is we're going to go through each of the major steps of the life cycle of an engagement, from scoping to fieldwork to delivery, which is basically the before, middle, and after of the pen test, and go over like what are the things you want to pay attention to, what are the questions you want to ask, and how are what are the main levers you can pull to get the most out of a penetration test. That way you can be sure that whatever it is that you want to get out of the test, that you're going to get that. Also, as a quick note, there's a good time to the middle of the presentation be a fine time to ask questions. If you have any questions, go and drop them into whichever chat that you're in, and we'll get it forwarded over to me. That way we can try to answer any questions if you happen to have them in the middle. Okay, cool. So let's go and get started. So the first is scoping. So scoping is basically everything that happens pre-engagement. Scoping is really important to the overall success of an engagement. The very first thing we want to do is just level us off with a running example. So rather than picking on a particular real example, we'll just make one up. Let's say there's bank.com, right? Bank.com is a mid-sized regional bank looking to branch out into more advanced financial services, and also in particular migrate from a self-hosting solution to like a cloud solution. So they used to have a business that was very simple. They would allow you to log in and you could do two things. You could deposit money, you could withdraw money. But now they're going to be doing more advanced like brokerage functionality, payment processing with third parties, that sort of thing. So there's a lot that could potentially go wrong with this kind of functionality, and the sort of thing that you would want to have some security eyeballs looking at this new functionality before it goes live. So this functionality isn't yet live. They're planning on it within the next quarter, and we're looking to see what vulnerabilities might exist within this new functionality before it sees the light of day with customers. Cool. So the very first thing we want to do with any penetration test is determine what the driving forces are for the engagement. So this could be a few things. The three major things that we see driving pen tests are either technical drivers, business drivers, or something else. First, being technical drivers, this is like what we're talking about in bank.com. So we're releasing a new product or service, and this is, we want to say before this functionality goes out there, we want to find as many vulnerabilities as we can within time and scope. That way we can catch these vulnerabilities before they go live to real customers. Now, it sounds obvious to say like, well, don't you always want to find as many vulnerabilities as possible within the engagement's time and scope? Well, not necessarily. Depending on the nature of the engagement, depending on what's driving that engagement, the goals of the engagement might be different. So letting us know right off the front, right off the bat, that like the goal of the engagement is to find as many bugs as you possibly can. That's actually really good information. In particular, narrowing that down can also be really helpful. Like, look, bank.com might come to us and say, hey, look, we just want to stay out of the news, right? We don't want to put out this new functionality and wake up the next morning and find out that like all of our customer data was stolen and we have massive egg on our face and we're losing business because of it. Nobody wants that. So it's perfectly reasonable to come out and say like, hey, look, it's great if you want to have some good, security hygiene findings or this or that, but I'm not really interested in that. Really, I'm just interested in like, I want to stay out of the news. So that kind of driver, that like emphasis behind the penetration test is really important to let us know ahead of time. Similarly, there's business drivers. Sometimes there isn't a new piece of functionality that got released, some new 2.0. Sometimes it's a business driver. So for instance, a common way that this occurs is through acquisition. Maybe company A hires or acquires company B, or is looking to acquire them, and they'll perform a penetration test as part of that due diligence in acquisition. This is perfectly reasonable, of course. I mean, when you buy a house, you go ahead and get an inspection on the house before you purchase the house, right? So this is a perfectly ordinary thing to do as part of a business acquisition, and it's a pretty important one too, since the results of a penetration test certainly can and have impacted the terms of an acquisition. This is absolutely a thing that could happen. Depending if you walk into a penetration test and then it turns out that there's just bugs riddled within the system, that would certainly impact your idea of the value of that system. So this is certainly an important factor to let us know ahead of time, like this is why this pen test is happening. Similarly, you might have just genuine interest, or maybe similarly, there's the product or service is inherently security focused. Like perhaps the product or service is like a security camera or something like that, right? That is where security is baked into the concept of the product itself. And so there's not any specific thing that happened that was requiring a penetration test as much as like we just need to bake in security from the very beginning. And that's awesome. If that's the case, then we'd love to know that. This is all important information that's going to seed things later on in the pen test, as we'll see. Cool. Okay, so the very next things we're going to do is gathering requirements. This is basically the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the engagement. So we're going to step through these one by one. So first is approach. So the approach to the application is something that we're going to be thinking about, Bishop Fox, like in the back of our minds as we're doing early scoping of this application. So the first thing is around what actual services to perform. And so it's easy to say, oh, well, we want to test bank.com, but there's a few ways you could actually come about that, couldn't it? You could come about it from an application penetrations standpoint, where we're you'll give us the source code to the application, and then we can do a white box test so we can try to find as many bugs as we can. In the hypothetical example that we gave, that's probably what we would recommend. But there's other ways of going about that, isn't there? You could come about it entirely from an external perspective. So we're given the like black box, like IP address ranges of the targets, and then given no other information, say, here to try to hack into this. And depending on what you're trying to get out of it, that might be reasonable. Or for instance, another thing could be that like maybe it's not necessarily the application that's being tested per se, as much as some new security controls. Maybe it's the case that the teams have just put in some new intrusion detection systems and antivirus, and you want to have an assessment of those systems. In which case, we're not going to give a source code. We're going to, try to emulate like a real world attack or something like that. But trying to frame, how we're going to go about the application and what services we're going to perform is obviously one of the very first things that we're going to try to determine. Also, what exactly is the target is going to be really key here too. Sometimes it's very simple. In the case of bank.com, we might just say it's the domain name bank.com, right? However, it's important to try to take a little bit of time to pin that down. So it's important to note here that scope is a legally binding entity. It's literally the only thing that differentiates a professional service like penetration testing and just illegally hacking somebody. So penetration testers will take that seriously. So if we say the engagement is for bank.com, and nothing else. And then in the middle of the penetration test, what you don't want to have happen is discover that, oh, it turns out that actually all of the interesting functionality occurs in an API that's api.bank.com. And now it's not clear whether that's in scope, and we might have to get a change order. And so you don't want to have that happening in the middle of the engagement, right? We want to try to hammer this out beforehand. So we don't need to have this be like laborious and explicit. Sometimes the scope where we're looking at here is difficult to pin down. It's like, new functionality. Maybe there was just some new piece of functionality existed within an application, and that's what we want to have as the scope. But just let us know what this is. We can work through it. But definitely be aware that limiting the scope could be difficult for us. So determining the depth of the engagement is next. So depth is, of course, really important. It's basically how much time, how much effort is going to be required to perform the engagement to a level that we are going to deem as like necessary to meet the goals of the engagement. So there's kind of two things that are in play here. So the first, of course, is technical, and the second is business-wise. So the first being technical is just the thing that we're testing, if it's an application or a network, how big or small is it? So engagements are necessarily time-boxed. They have to begin and end at some point. So how much time and effort are we going to be putting into any particular engagement? So as part of this, you'll be receiving a scoping survey. This will ask for information like lines of code, what languages, technologies are being used, frameworks, cloud providers, that kind of thing, right? And I would urge you to be diligent and fill this out, since determining like the size of the engagement is going to be really key towards the success here. I think that we always do custom scoping for all of our engagements. We don't do simple like t-shirt sizes, like small, medium, large. We try to make sure that the amount of effort that we're putting in is appropriate for the particular application or network or product or service that we're actually going to be testing. And then the second factor here, aside from the technical, is business. It's entirely possible that maybe in this case of bank.com, that we're looking for something very quick. They say like, hey, look, we're not interested in any of these like low-level findings. We just want you to come in, like kick the tires, tell us if anything is crazy broken, and then we can move from there. That's perfectly reasonable. We're going to take a very quick swing at it. The time and the scope is going to be smaller. We'll be very explicit that those are the goals of the engagement, right? We're not going to try to get, try to find every vulnerability that we possibly can. We're just going to be going for the big ones and see if we can find those. Or maybe it's something it's a different, right? If it's a if we have more time, if that's within the budget of the customer, if that's something that would fulfill the goals of the engagement, then we could go have a much more in-depth approach. But that's all something that we work out beforehand at this stage in the scoping sort of phase. Cool. All right. So then focus. Focus is a little bit more tricky to describe, but I think it's easy to get at with two possible different scenarios. So imagine our bank.com customer. They're in a state of what we might call blissful ignorance. So they are in the middle, perhaps still, of engineering some system, some new functionality that they're adding into their existing application. And they have no idea at the outset what they're getting themselves into. Is it, filled with bugs? Are they relatively secure, but maybe they just need a couple of things tightened up here or there? And so we're at the point of the engagement. What we want to focus on is clarifying that for them, giving them clarity on like what it is that the current state of the application security is in. Right? Makes perfect sense. That is not necessarily the case in general. Certainly, you can imagine a different scenario in definitely this is the case for like mid to large size clients where they're just inundated with bugs. They have so many bugs. They've got an Archer system, some SIM that is used to do nothing but catalog all the vulnerabilities that they're aware of across many different applications. They're not even sure which among them are even valid. Maybe half of them are complete bogus. And it doesn't do them any good in that case, right? To take this pile, this haystack of vulnerabilities and just shovel more vulnerabilities on top of it. That doesn't do them any good. And so really what you need in this sort of scenario is not to just pile on more vulnerabilities, but help you prioritize, cut through it to understand root causes. So in this case, rather than just piling on more vulnerabilities, you could try to identify patterns. So for example, we might say that the organization has had a huge history of password problems. So people leave passwords laying around in places they shouldn't. There's bad passwords that are just unnecessarily simple. They're bypassing the complexity rules in clever ways, right? This is a completely common thing for organizations to have problems with. And so rather than cataloging more and more instances of people using passwords in a poor way, try to cut to the root of this and say, hey, look, like you should probably be implementing a single sign-on solution. That way you don't have a new password for every little service. Like you should just be just pick an SSO provider. It doesn't even matter who, and just go with them. Like that would be a really good strategic, actionable piece of advice that would chop down a huge section of this massive pile of bugs, right? In a way that just doesn't apply to scenario one. Like they're looking to find specific bugs, that way they can squash them, right? So knowing which one of these you're in is really important, and we can help you find out if you're not familiar with where you might be in this. Like we can help you out, of course. All right, then I want to call out, of course, that scope and focus are different things. Recall that scope should be well-defined, but it is a legally binding entity. So when in doubt, restrict focus, not scope. So focus is about what you intend, like what we're going to be like really going after during the pen test, whereas scope is like a legally binding entity. For instance, imagine in our bank.com scenario, remember they're migrating from like a self-hosting provider up to a cloud. And so they're still in the middle of building the system while we're penetration testing it because it's not live yet. And they might say, hey, look, we actually haven't finished the cloud migration yet. And so by the time we're doing the pen test, we're still in this self-hosted environment. That's fine. Actually, we love it when we're able to get in and do security testing early before a system is like, fully engineered. That's totally great. You might in that sort of scenario then tell us like, hey, just kind of ignore any of this self-hosting specific vulnerabilities, just deprioritize that because it's all going away anyway, right? That makes total sense. Whereas if you say like, it's out of scope, then we're going to be legally obligated for not touching that. That's probably not what you wanted. That way you can not necessarily ignore all those vulnerabilities, all those issues entirely, because sometimes they might be relevant even in a future scenario. If you're migrating from one environment to another, a vulnerability in system A might make its way into system B, then again, it might not. So it's good to have that information, but also tell us to like not prioritize that while we're pen testing, because that's not really interesting from a pen testing perspective. That's not where you want to find bugs then. All right, next is staffing. So of course, this is something on our end. We want to try to come up with the dream team for you. We want to come up with people that can perform the test, since at the end of the day, actual human beings have to perform the test. Even in our AI-based penetration testing service, we still have humans in the loop. So finding the right people for the right job is really important. I like to try to describe staffing not as in like this linear scale of like there are good pen testers and bad ones. It's more like superheroes, or maybe like X-Men, where we each have our own little superpowers, and trying to find the one that like perfectly fits into the exact scenario that you have is the goal of the game here. So your web application might be ASP.NET based and in the AWS cloud, And finding somebody with that exact set of experience, who is the foremost AWS and ASP.NET experts, like that's what we're looking for. And so this does come out with a caveat here to avoid, to the extent possible, requesting specific consultants. This comes from a good place. I totally understand why this happens. Usually this comes about from when like maybe you've had a bad experience with a pen tester in the past, and then come over Bishop Fox is maybe the next pen test company you give a shot to, and it goes great. For whatever reason, this time it just works. You felt like the expertise was good, that our understanding of the application was good, the service rate on time, things like that, right? The engagement was a success. And so you say, next time, I want to ask for that specific consultant again. Obviously, we'll work with, if the client insists, we're not going to say no. But the reason we would hesitate or ask you to hesitate on that kind of request is that the next pen test might not necessarily be that person's specific area of expertise. Maybe it worked out so well because you got that ASP.NET expert on the ASP.NET app, right? But the very next pen test might be for something that's like embedded C. It's just a very different sort of experience that is required for that kind of engagement, and that person just might not be the expert in that field. So I assure you, we have plenty of experts across virtually everything that could possibly be pen tested. So do just give other pen testers a try and avoid requesting specific consultants if you possibly can. And then coming up on last here is tooling. So definitely some cases, all that's required of a pen test is a browser and access to the internet. If that's the case, then great. But sometimes pen tests require specific tooling. Definitely this is the case with product security review. We often refer to product security review as the thing where if it breaks when you drop it, then it's a product security review. And often that requires specialized tooling that's unique to the individual piece of product. So for instance, in one case, we're on an engagement that we discover only after opening up the clamshell or after using the device for some piece of hardware that talks over Zigbee. And then like you don't want to have that happen like during the engagement. We realize, oh no, we have no equipment on hand for performing Zigbee hacking. That's like kind of specialized equipment that we can obtain. We have that, but I didn't have it on me at that moment, and that's all just time that's going to wind up being wasted trying to obtain those sorts of things. Sometimes it's not physical tools like Zigbee hacking gear. Sometimes it's lead research, where it might be the case that there's the pen test is taking place within the context of some very niche system. Maybe that's critical infrastructure, where it just exists in this very niche universe that you kind of have to be familiar with in order to make sense of. Or maybe it's something to do with financial things, where like financial arbitrage is kind of its own very unique sort of set of like its own universe. You might need to do some like lead research on that. And so again, we just want to know ahead of the game whether this is something that is going to be necessary. And if you're not aware of what these might be, then go ahead and let us know. We can work through or try to figure this out on our own as well. Certainly, it's the case plenty of times where there might be some core piece of functionality, some library or product that's a black box to you, that's used somewhere within the application or service. And if it's the case that you don't know how that works, that's fine. We could deal with that. We could try to look it up ourselves, or if we're just going to have to prepare for the unknown, then it's good to have the unknown be known ahead of time. And then scheduling. Of course, like I said before, the pen tests have to happen at some time. And the main call out here is to be wary of rushes. So there's no sure sign of a pen test that is likely to not meet the goals of the engagement than when it's a rushed engagement. Almost always this is because then all of these things that we were just talking about that you want to make sure you line up ahead of time are being skipped through, right? If we scramble the jets and say, hey, look, we need to get this going next week, we can make that happen. That is a thing that's potentially possible, depending on availability, of course. But the chances of something getting missed, something getting dropped along the way are just very high. So be wary of rushes. One piece of advice, of course, as well is try, if you can, to schedule tests in the summer. Just due to the way that corporate budgets work, people tend to realize that they have remaining security budget left on the books by the end of the year-ish. And so pen tests tend to get scheduled in Q4. So consequently, Q4 is our crunch time, and you'll just find more availability earlier on in the year. So that exact request of like, hey, can you guys start next week? In the summertime, we might say, yeah, absolutely, let's get going on this. In Q4, the answer might be no, depending on availability. It'd be certainly a lot harder. So if possible, try to schedule tests out in the summer. And then resist the urge to change scheduling. Of course, obviously, this is a hardship on our end, but not just that. It can cause problems for the engagement itself, the actual success of the engagement. So for instance, if we're about to get going on a test that's going to be starting next week, and everything goes fine with it, but then there's some thing that happened, maybe the application's not quite ready yet, or there's some technical thing that has to get pushed out, and then we have to push out a week, right? Well, now suddenly that causes a cascade of issues where the people that were staffed on our end to perform the engagement might have to get rescheduled. It's going to reshuffle everything. And now that dream team of ASP.NET experts are going to be somewhere else. And the new team is going to be, of course, excellent, but not like the exact set of experts that we had scheduled for several months back. And so these kinds of hiccups in scheduling can have big ripple-on effects. And then preparing the environment. So some of this sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how easy it is to overlook some aspects of this. So is the target ready to be tested? Certainly this is the case with something like our bank.com example, where the application is being built as we're testing it. It's not yet fully operational, right? And so do all the major features actually work? I can't tell you how many times we've logged into a system in order to pen test it. And then the very first thing you see is a big 500 error. The entire application crashes. And if you can't even use the app, you can't really pen test it. And that's just really unfortunate when that sort of thing happens. And so taking a little bit of time ahead to make sure that everything is functioning as expected is really important. Obviously, we're going to help you through this. We're going to do some of this for you even as well, making sure that giving a direct list of things to look out for. Also, is there data populated within the system? This is actually a big one. So you imagine if you're a bank, one of the very first things you want to test for, one of the important things that bank.com would want to look out for is, can user A access information from user B? That should not happen. That would be a really big deal if users could access data across account. And so if we are in some pre-production environment that only has one user, you can log in and everything works, but there's only one user in the system and you can't self-serve to add a new user, then we're just going to be unable to test for that sort of vulnerability, right? So making sure that there's data populated within the system is really important as well. Also, do testers just literally have access? That means credentials or sometimes network access. Sometimes what happens, I've seen this before with a really rushed application sort of timeline, is we'll have a link and we'll scramble the jets to try to decide, here's the application pen test, this URL. And then only after the engagement begins, we realize that actually that's on the internal VPN of the customer's attack surface. And we suddenly have to figure out VPN access. They have to ship us laptops. It becomes a whole thing, right? These are the sorts of things you want to figure out ahead of time. We can work through whatever access requirements are necessary, but we want to work through those before the engagement starts, not during it. And then lastly on this is to disable or like allow us through any external controls. So WAFs, IDSs, things like that. Especially if you're in our scenario of like bank.com, where you want to find as many vulnerabilities as you can, then you don't want to have us wasting time going through the WAF. In my many years of pen testing at Bishop Fox, I've had exactly 0 instances where a web application firewall prevented me from exploiting a vulnerability. It's just a matter of being annoyed and getting a bypass that works through the WAF. And so that's just not a thing that you want to be wasting our and therefore your time on if you can help it. If the goal of the engagement is to find vulnerabilities in the application, then disable the WAF. That way it's just not wasting our time. Then again, if the goal of the engagement is to test these technical controls, then by all means leave them on. That's the whole point of engagement then, right? If you just invested in a bunch of these technical controls, WAFs, IDS, antivirus, maybe even personnel controls, right? Then by all means, leave this on. Let's see if it would catch a real attacker. That's definitely a thing that we could test for, if that is the point of the engagement. All right, so key takeaways. Be explicit with pen test objectives. Let us know like what the goal of the engagement is, like right up front. I've never complained about having too much information when scoping a system. So just feel free to dump as much information, as much data, as much documentation about the system as you have. When in doubt, restricting the focus rather than the scope of an engagement is the way to go. Scheduling the pen test in the summer if you can. And then testing, if you want to test the application and not the technical controls, then disable things like WAFs. Okay, we've made it to Fieldwork. So at this point, the application penetration test, or the network, or the penetration test in general, is being performed. So what now? So there are, of course, usually some conversation around rules of engagement. This is usually about like, at what point do we stop? Like, what are the things that we want to watch out for when actually performing engagement? So some things that this might entail. So I want to say off the top, of course, we'll play by whatever rules you set. We're professionals at this, but depending on what these rules entail, it could have downstream effects on the quality of the test. So for instance, nighttime testing windows. Again, this is a thing where I totally get where this comes from. Maybe you had a previously bad experience. A pen tester did something reckless, knocked over a server and caused an outage in the middle of the day when customers were using the service, and it was just a really bad time. And so we figure, all right, all of our pen tests going forward, we're going to do them at night. That way, if we cause another outage, it won't be in the middle of the important business day. And so while that seems like wisdom, it could have impacts further on in engagement, like staffing, for instance. Maybe we're just not able to get the like foremost expert on the specific niche that your product or service is. It's just not available for night testing. Or also, this could exacerbate project blockers. So for instance, if the night testing is going on, then is there someone who's also available, like in the graveyard shift, to answer any questions in a rapid way in that period? So what that could mean is that you don't want to have a 24-hour like turnover period for Q&A. So if there's a technical problem, like, oh no, the application credentials don't work, is that a thing that's going to take 24 hours to turn around to fix? Things like client-owned laptops are definitely another thing that we certainly are a thing that happen. Sometimes all of the testing has to occur within this restricted environment. But you just want to make sure that when we're doing this, the laptops are there for the access and not for restriction. It definitely happens all the time where we have to do all of our testing from within a client-owned laptop. But then the laptop itself has a bunch of technical controls meant to prevent the very thing that we're trying to perform, which is hacking. So they'll have like DLP solutions on there that will prevent us from removing data, like providing a report, or data exfiltration rules that are going to prevent us from performing our jobs. Basically, you don't want to have us fighting the laptop and spending our time doing that when that's not the point of the engagement. So be watchful for that. On one extreme case, this is a true story, performed an entire engagement while controlling somebody else's screen in a WebEx screen share. It was a wild sort of scenario, and let me tell you, the engagement was a success despite that scenario, not because of it. Cool. This is a good moment. I've got a question or two here. Once a pen test is already underway, are there any red flags that suggest it's not going to be very valuable? And if we spot those, what can teams actually do to fix this? That's a really good question. So that actually will get into. Actually, I'm going to come to that in just a moment. I think this is a good moment to talk about it. I think it's like 2 slides ahead. So let me get to that in just a moment here. Being available. Okay, so this is something that I want to call out. You should be available for questions from the technical team. This isn't necessarily to say that you need to be on call. Certainly, we don't want to burden your teams with a ton of communication back and forth. But there's going to be some technical questions from our team at some point around, like, hey, how does this system work? How does X, Y, or Z operate? And it'd be really nice to be able to have a direct line of communication to some of the technical teams on your end as well. Developer Slack works great for this. So we could use formal meetings, like if there's a status report meeting like once a day. Technically, we could do that, but the problem with it is then there's this long turnaround time where if we say, hey, do you have any Swagger documentation for an API over here, right? API.bank.com. If we make a request on Monday and then it gets forwarded to the teams, and then by the time it gets like over to the teams on Tuesday, we might not get a response by Wednesday, and we're just burning time without getting an answer to this question, right? It'd be really easy to just shoot this over to somebody. It should be low effort, low communication, low bandwidth. And only tech talk. We don't want to use this for status reports. If you're going to be really tempted in this sort of quick communication session to ask us like, so hey, you guys got anything good yet? But I urge you not to do that, because then we're going to have to get into reporting mode. We don't want to give you wrong information, and so suddenly it's going to turn into calcifying our current work into a report that we weren't really prepared to do yet. It's gonna be a whole thing. So we want to leave this just for purely tech talk, back and forth about questions and answers around like, hey, like, do you have any more information about this, or how does this thing work, or what have you. And this is more applicable, of course, towards like white box sort of engagements where we're maybe given source code or we're given developer access, where you want to find as many bugs as possible within the time scope. And that way just can really facilitate that for us to bootstrap our understanding of the application or service as quickly as possible. That way we don't have to be discovering this entirely on our own. Okay, we have another question here. It says, our apps depend on a lot of services we don't fully own, including some AI features built by other teams or vendors. How do you think about testing risk in those areas, whether the scope turning into a mess? That's a really good question. So AI features, I feel like they come in like kind of 2 flavors. From a pen testing perspective, there's the first where AI is maybe even prominently featured, but maybe it's not really like baked into the core functionality of much of what the application is doing. So a common way, of course, that this occurs is through chatbots. Maybe there's a little pop-up that occurs in the bottom right-hand corner of the application that says like, hey, here's a little AI assistant. And you can chat with it, but that's literally all it does. you can chat with it. It's not hooked up to anything. It can't operate any real world things, right? So in those cases, its impact on the rest of the environment are pretty limited. Then there's other systems where AI is maybe not so prominent, but it's actually baked in. So one common way you might see this is AI systems that are meant to like machine read things that are not normally machine readable. So like maybe you upload a PDF into this application, and then AI is going to like tear apart the PDF and take all the individual sections and read them and then process them in some way. And now that is a thing that suddenly has knock-on consequences of like security down the line, right? And also if the services are things that are like not even owned by you, if these are third-party services like out in the wild, that gets a little bit hairier. So if they're third-party services, we could do this one of two ways. One is to getting permission from the third party, and then we could just pull them into scope. This is a thing that we've done in the past. It depends on the nature of your relationship with that third party. If you're a small fish and they're the big fish, then they might just say no. Or they might just provide you a letter of assessment that they've already been performed or something like that. If the relationship is flipped, then you might have the sway to say, like, hey, no, we really, like, before we go with you, we want you to be part of this pen test. That might be the case. If it's a piece of third-party software that's like included in with your, it's not a remote third-party service, but it's, you know, a library or something like that that you're using internally, then of course we could include that in with pen test. That's perfectly game to pen test. We just won't necessarily know all the innards of how it works. That's fine. It's totally acceptable for us to have a little black box within the application that we'll figure out as we go. And then we have one more question here around after the report comes back, how do you separate issues that really matter from the noise? This is also an excellent question. We have a whole slide that's directly related to this right at the end. So I'm going to come back to, I have two questions to come back to. All right, so status reports. So this is around question number one. So how do you know if the goals of the engagement are being met or if there's any red flags? This is the time to do it. So we should be having regular status reports along the way. Status reports are the time to double back on these goals and know whether the engagement is becoming a success or not. Whether it's a success or not should not be a surprise at the end of the engagement. If you're doing an engagement and even if it was a success and you loved how it went, if the fact that it was a success came as a surprise to you at the end, then something went wrong. The point of the engagement is to make sure that we're getting coverage of all the things we need. So some questions you want to be asking here are like, are there any blocking issues? That's a pretty obvious one, but are we on schedule for delivery? A lot of times the thing that is really important here is not whether the technical work is being done, but is it being done on time? Sometimes there's this really important deadline, like we're going live on the 1st. And if we don't have the report, 2 weeks before that, we're just not going to have time to fix these bugs in time for release. So being on schedule is incredibly important. So that may be the case in your sort of scenario. Is all of the scope accessible? Like, are we missing something? Maybe it's the case that, look, we're able to make progress, we're doing all the things, but this piece of scope over here, some section of the application, we just aren't able to hit it for one reason or another. We need to do that. It's not blocking us yet, but it will be in the future. Is the reality of the engagement matching our expectation from scoping? This is actually a pretty important one. So like, it gets at like, is there a need for additional scope? So a good example of how this might play out, something that's happened in the past is, this is a real example. We scoped an application as kind of small. We didn't think it was very large. It didn't seem like it had a lot of complicated things going on inside of it. So we scoped it a certain way that was on the smaller end. And then upon receiving the source code, because it was a white box engagement, in the first day of the project, we realized that, oh, actually, most of the application's functionality exists within stored procedures in the database, which was a kind of an unexpected twist. But also, it turns out the application was an order of magnitude larger than we thought it was, because all of that functionality wasn't in the scoping survey that we received about like how many lines of code you have. It just didn't occur to the person at the time to include the like database stored procedures in with a source code. if that makes sense. That's a perfectly reasonable mistake to make, but it did cause a bit of a hiccup where we have to say, oh no, like, are we now at risk of not meeting the goals of the engagement because it's so much larger than we thought that we're not going to be able to get to everything in time? So these are the kinds of things you want to be asking, like, is there anything like that going on? Or is it going more or less as expected? So yeah, a good call out here is that the status report meetings, to the extent that you possibly can, try to avoid using that as an opportunity for just getting, hey, what are the latest vulnerabilities? Like, hey, what finding do you have today? What finding do you have today? It sounds, you're gonna be exceedingly curious. I would be curious about this, of course, right? The reason that this sounds like a good thing, but might not be, this will have implications, is that reporting on vulnerabilities is really important to us, obviously. It's the main thing that we do. And we have a zero tolerance policy for false positives, Bishop Fox. So one of the risks, if we give you kind of these early reports, is that they might not be fully fleshed out yet. So if you have a vulnerability in a thing that we just found it, and you want us to notify you immediately, it might turn out to be an illusion. It might turn out to be like, it looks really vulnerable, but then upon closer inspection, it turns out that's actually just perfectly normal. We would like to compare ourselves to other professional services like doctors. And you wouldn't do this to a doctor, right? You get some blood work drawn, send it out to a lab, the doctor goes away, they do some analysis, they do whatever they need to do with the data, and they come back and then they tell you the results. You wouldn't want them to, the very moment they believe there might be an issue in your blood work, to text you right away before they've verified that it's actually a concern that you need to be worried about. So I would just say to have a little patience. We're going to report things to you the moment that it's actually ready. This comes with one major caveat, of course, with critical severity findings. So in fact, this is how we define a critical severity finding, which is something that cannot wait any longer. It has to be reported to the client immediately. So a good example of this is something like if we find a vulnerability that allows us to gain code execution on a server. Obviously, that sounds bad. It depends on the nature of the server. Maybe nothing interesting is happening there, but let's suppose it's kind of important, right? That's pretty high risk, but we're going to work with that initially. If we find a vulnerability in a server that lets us get a code execution on, and then we discover we're not the first ones here. There's evidence that some other nefarious group has already exploited this. That's something we would notify you of immediately. That's not something we would ever wait on. We're going to let you know right away because there's whole teams that need to get involved. That's a whole thing. So if it's something that needs to be notified immediately, that's something it's going to be called out as critical risk. So the other main reason to avoid talking about findings in status reports is also just that findings aren't silos unto themselves. Vulnerabilities are themselves superpowers. They allow us to do something that wasn't previously able to be done beforehand. So maybe a good example of how this might work is in this migration to a cloud provider, there might be a database server, and this database server, suppose we are able to get at the access to it. There's a SQL injection vulnerability, say, lets us dump the contents of this database. And then in the process of doing so, we find that there's information for other applications that don't belong to you in this database. Like, that would be troubling. Certainly, depending on the nature of how this database works, this could happen because of the hosting provider or something like that. That would be a major issue that we would only find if we could continue on with the pen testing beyond the simple, like, oh, we verified that SQL injection works phase. So one of the points of the pen test is not just to identify, oh, here's a vulnerability, but also figure out what are the consequences of that. How far can we take this? What's the real impact of it? And if vulnerabilities get fixed on us, as it were, immediately upon identification, then that's just not something we're going to be able to do. Okay, so key takeaways from Fieldwork. this is my cat. He's an old man and gets cuddles anytime he wants them, even if they're in the middle of the presentation. So a designated engineer to be available to the assessment team during the engagement. Again, this doesn't have to be on call, just have somebody who's like designated as the go-to. That way we can ask questions to somebody and we don't have to figure who that is during engagement. And then use status report meetings to gauge project status and not daily findings updates. All right, then delivery. This is everything post-engagement. So you've gotten a report readout. This comes to our third question here about what separates issues that really matter most from the noise. So there's going to be an executive summary in this report. It's going to have a lot of words in it, but I would urge you to read it. The context here is going to be really important, especially if you're in that second scenario that we discussed earlier about like maybe you're just inundated with bugs. The executive summary is our opportunity to speak directly to your team and say, like, here are some high-level suggestions on what is best for the organization or the application at a high level. Like maybe we found vulnerability A, B, C, and D, and they aren't the same vulnerabilities, but maybe they kind of rhyme, right? And so they represent some commonality that needs to be addressed. Were there any troubling patterns of vulnerabilities? Like maybe there wasn't there was not just a series of vulnerabilities, but they're all kind of the same sort of thing, right? That's the kind of thing we're going to get across in the executive summary. Also, how does the application compare to the industry? This is a really good question that people ask us all the time. Is like, I don't know, we got a pen test report, we fixed a bunch of bugs, but like, did we do well? Is this good? Is it bad? Like, it's hard to judge, from the engineer's perspective. Like, are we doing all right? Is this good? Is it bad? This is something that we can try to answer for you. It's hard to answer objectively. It's not like we can give you a grade. You're 79 out of 100 or something like that, but we can at least try to help you understand. And also making sure that the impact of all the individual vulnerabilities are clear, so that something doesn't just get lost through the noise. So have a plan for what to actually do with the pen test report. So the worst way that this occurs, this is tragically a true story where in one instance we perform an application pen test, we find a series of vulnerabilities, we deliver it to the client, it's great, everyone's happy. A year comes around, they want to have us do an engagement again for the same application. That's awesome. We get in there, we start doing the assessment. We discover that all the same vulnerabilities from last year are still present in the app. Nothing has changed. And then we ask why, like, hey, like, what happened here? What, none of the issues were found from last year, from last year's report. And then the answer comes back of like, what pen test last year? And it turns out that like our contact, the person that we were talking to at the client's end left the company, and it just kind of sat on their desk and they didn't tell anybody about it. And so nobody at the company even knew that there was a pen test from last year. And that's just tragic. You don't want to have that happen. So have an explicit set of plans in place of like who is going to be responsible for fixing the bugs from a low-level technical perspective. Some issues are going to be simple to fix. Maybe it's just you zigged, reissued, or zagged, and then that's that. And some things are going to be larger. There might imply larger organizational changes to policies or the technical controls organization-wide, right? Maybe you have to roll out a SSO that's like company-wide. So these are all things that you're going to want to figure out. You don't want to have to figure out after the engagement about like what would be the best way of doing this. So key takeaways here, asking good questions on the report readout to help you make sense of the report, making sure that everything makes sense in your head, that the engagement was a success at this stage. And then having a plan to remediate any issues before the report actually comes to your desk. Okay, so we're almost at the end here. We have an additional resource. If you go to bishopfox.com/resources, there's another guide here to penetration testing called Fortifying Your Applications. It's excellent. I'd go ahead and give that a read as well if you want to some further reading. And then now is a good time. If there's any additional questions, we can take them. I'll pause here and filibuster for a moment. Cool, we have another question that came through. Says, would you consider doing another presentation with a focus on internal infrastructure testing? Yeah, including orgs with remote workers, hopefully secure VPNs. That's a good question. Some of this has, of course, been application kind of centric, but network penetration testing is absolutely something that we do a lot of work in. The sort of application or a network pen test with like an internal like Active Directory environment is kind of its own thing. I would say it's almost a dying breed, actually. More and more companies are moving to a world without Active Directory, but it's 100% a thing that we perform as part of our services at Bishop Fox. And so we don't have time for it today, unfortunately, but yeah, we'd love to hit that again with more focused advice on like specifically how to do one of those in a manner that we think would be successful. All right, let's see. All right, I think that's about it for us then. Thanks everybody for hanging out with us, and good luck.